Welcome back to Cozy Side Audio. Tonight's story is soft, slow, and written from the heart. Perfect for those quiet hours. If it touches you, please like, share it with someone special, and subscribe for more gentle moments. Let's begin the story. Cozy Side Audio presents When We Meet Again. Chapter 1, The Booking. The first thing Hazley noticed was the smell. Not the generic roasted coffee aroma that clung to every corner cafe in the city, but something softer, richer. Cinnamon, maybe? Vanilla. A sweetness woven into the earthy undertone of freshly ground beans. It made the quiet little bookstore cafe feel less like a business and more like stepping into someone's living room. Worn wood floors, mismatched armchairs that had clearly lived other lives before ending up here. A wall of books tilting in their cases as though tired of holding themselves upright. Her heels clicked across the old floorboards as she entered, laptop bag over her shoulder, phone buzzing in her palm with back-to-back emails. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and undecided outside. The kind of day where the sky looked like it couldn't be bothered to choose between drizzle and sun. Perfect weather for meetings. She thought nobody wanted to linger outdoors. Her client was already waiting at a corner table. She spotted him instantly, suit a little too stiff, expression a little too impatient, as if this cafe was beneath him. Hazley forced a smile, smoothing down the front of her cream blouse before walking over. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and dove into talk of seating arrangements, color palettes, and budget constraints. It was her world now, event planning, and she thrived in it. The details that overwhelmed other people were puzzle pieces to her, slots waiting to be filled. But she found her focus straying. Every time the bell above the door jingled, every time the soft scrape of a cup against the counter cut through their conversation, her eyes flicked toward the barista. He moved differently than the rest, quieter, deliberate. Dark hair that had grown just past the point of being tidy fell into his eyes as he bent to wipe down the counter. He didn't rush like the others, didn't fill the silence with chatter. There was something about him, a shape her memory almost wanted to hold. The meeting stretched, notes filling her planner in tidy lines. Eventually, her client snapped his briefcase closed with the kind of finality that meant the rest would be handled over email. They shook hands again, his cologne sharp enough to sting. And then he was gone, leaving her in the cafe with a half-drunk cappuccino and a growing sense of unfinished business. Hazley lingered. She wasn't sure why. She told herself it was because she liked the atmosphere, that maybe she could knock out a few more emails while she was here. But her eyes kept drifting back toward the counter. Toward him. He wore no name tag. His shirt was simple black, sleeves rolled just above his elbows, forearms dusted with flour or sugar from the pastries he'd been arranging earlier. His jawline was sharper than she expected, as though life had chiseled away at him since whatever last memory she was trying to summon. And then, when he glanced up, she froze. His eyes. There it was, that tug, the electric snap of recognition flickering in her chest like a light bulb trying to spark to life. But it couldn't be. Could it? He looked away before she could place him, sliding a plate across the counter for a customer, then disappearing into the back with a tray of mugs. Her heart raced in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. She dug her nails into her palm, whispering to herself, "No, Hazley, don't be ridiculous." People had familiar faces all the time. Cities were full of half-strangers who looked like someone you used to know. Still, she stayed. The cafe emptied by slow degrees, people slipping back into the drizzle-gray world outside. The light shifted, golden through the smudged windows, until the only sound left was the quiet hiss of the espresso machine and the scrape of chairs being stacked. She checked her phone. Nearly closing. And she was still here. The man behind the counter reappeared, wiping his hands on a rag. Up close, his profile was clearer, and the years peeled back all at once. Hazley's breath caught. It was him. Stuart Rowe. Her Stuart. The boy who once sat behind her in homeroom, who used to tap his pencil against her desk until she turned around laughing. The boy who dragged her into conversations she never would have dared to join. The boy who made her believe she wasn't invisible. Now older, dimmer, a man carrying quiet in his bones. She rose before she could talk herself out of it, crossing the creaky floor to the counter. He glanced up, polite but distant, the way strangers look at each other. "Hi," she said softly. "Hey," he returned, wiping the counter again. His voice was deeper now, but stripped of the brightness she remembered. You don't recognize me, do you?" His brow furrowed, faint lines etching between his eyes. "Sorry, should I?" Her throat tightened. All the years, all the times she'd replayed memories of him pulling her out of silence gone from his memory? Instead of answering, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. It startled him. She felt the stiff shock in his shoulders, the way his rag slipped from his hand. For a long second, he didn't move, and then, tentatively, his arms lifted, returning the hug with hesitation. When he pulled back, his expression had changed. His eyes widened, the faintest flicker of recognition igniting. "Hazley?" His voice broke on her name. Her answering smile was wobbly with relief. "Took you long enough." Chapter 2. Recognition. The sound of her own name still lingered in the air, fragile and uncertain, as though Stuart wasn't entirely convinced he'd said it right. Hazley pulled back enough to see his face clearly. There it was, the boy she'd known, buried beneath the lines of adulthood. His jaw was sharper, cheekbones a little more pronounced, but his eyes, those were the same. Wide, dark, and carrying too much of the world. She laughed, the sound shaky with relief. "I was beginning to think I'd imagined you." He blinked, still looking at her as though he couldn't quite reconcile the present with the past. "Hazley Grant," he said slowly, tasting the name. Then, a small, incredulous shake of his head. "Wow, it's been, what, 15 years? "Closer to 10, she corrected, though it felt longer. A decade stretched like an ocean between then and now. Stuart glanced at the clock on the far wall, then back to her. "We're about to close up." His tone was polite, not unkind, but distant. "I figured." She set her laptop bag on the nearest chair and crossed her arms, planting herself as though she had no intention of leaving. "That's why I waited." He raised an eyebrow. "You waited?" "Of course I waited." She gave him a look that felt braver than she actually was inside. What kind of person would I be if I just walked out without saying hi? For a moment, the corner of his mouth twitched, like he wanted to smile but didn't quite have the energy. Most people probably would have. "Well," she said brightly, "lucky for you, I'm not most people." By the time the cafe lights dimmed and the other barista left with a cheerful wave, it was just the two of them. Stuart busied himself behind the counter, moving cups, wiping surfaces that were already spotless. Hazley perched on a bar stool, chin resting in her hand, watching him like he was a puzzle she hadn't solved yet. The silence stretched. She finally broke it. "So, this is your place?" He hesitated before answering. "Not mine. I just run it. Mostly." That made her pause. In high school, Stuart had been larger than life, the boy everyone noticed without him trying. He'd been the one to lead group projects, the one to crack jokes loud enough for the whole classroom to hear. Now, he spoke like every word cost him something. "You've been here long?" she asked gently. "Couple years." "And before that?" He shrugged. "A little of everything. Jobs that didn't stick." She opened her mouth and closed it again. The Stuart she remembered would have had stories, whole monologues about the ridiculous customers he'd met or the places he'd traveled. This version offered nothing but vague outlines. A lump rose in her throat. She thought back to junior year, the first time he'd ever really noticed her. She had been sitting alone at lunch, head bent over her notebook. Shy, quiet, the kind of girl people overlooked. Stuart had dropped into the seat across from her with a grin that made the whole table brighter. "Why do you always hide back here?" he'd asked, unwrapping his sandwich. She remembered blinking at him, confused that he was talking to her at all. "I don't hide." "You do, every day. Same corner, same notebook. You're like a ghost." She'd bristled then, defensive. but he'd only smiled wider. Guess I'll just have to haunt you back then. And he had. Day after day, he'd shown up, pulling her into conversation, cracking jokes until she laughed out loud. Until people noticed she existed. Until she started to believe she belonged. Now, sitting in the cafe, she realized the roles had reversed. Stuart was the ghost. She leaned forward, folding her arms on the counter. You really don't remember me at first, did you? He winced, looking guilty. It's been a long time. People change. Not that much. Her smile softened. You used to be unforgettable. The words hung between them. His eyes flicked away as though the compliment cut more than it healed. Finally, he set down the rag he'd been twisting in his hands. You look different. More confident. Like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. It startled her, the accuracy of it. She had built her career on certainty, on being the calm in the chaos. But part of her still felt like the girl with the notebook, hoping someone would see her. Thanks to you, maybe, she said quietly. His brows pulled together. Me? You don't even realize, do you? She shook her head, smiling at the memory. You were the one who pulled me out of my shell back then. You made me feel like I mattered. Stuart looked down at the counter, his expression unreadable. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, in a voice softer than she'd ever heard from him before. Funny. I don't feel like I matter much these days. The words landed heavy, cutting through the warmth of the cafe. Hazley's heart ached, but she didn't push, didn't pry. Instead, she reached across the counter, laying her hand over his. You do, she said firmly, even if you don't see it right now. For the first time all night, Stuart looked directly at her. And for just a flicker, she saw it the boy she remembered. The spark that had once lit up entire rooms. It vanished quickly, shuddered away. But it was enough to make her vow, right then, that she wouldn't let him disappear from her life again. When they finally stepped outside, the city was hushed, the rain having decided on a soft drizzle after all. Streetlights glowed against the wet pavement. Stuart locked the door behind them, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. Thanks for stopping by, he said, polite again, retreating into distance. Hazley tilted her face toward the rain, then back to him. Don't thank me. This isn't the end, Stuart. He gave her a look she couldn't quite read. We'll see. But she knew. Deep down, she knew. She wasn't going to let him fade. Not this time. Chapter 3. Echoes of Color. Hazley woke to the hum of her phone buzzing against the nightstand. It was early, barely light outside, and her inbox was already brimming with reminders, requests, questions. She rubbed her eyes, dragging herself upright, but her mind wasn't on work. It was on Stuart. She had replayed the moment 100 times in the restless hours of the night, the feel of his arms finally circling her in that hesitant hug, the way his voice cracked when he said her name. She had pictured the cafe, its warm light spilling against the rainy street, and wondered if he was thinking of her too. It was strange seeing him like that. He had once been the sun in every room, impossible to ignore. Now he seemed content to hide in the shadows, shrinking himself small. And yet, even diminished, he still tugged at her. She dressed quickly, slipping into a pale sweater and jeans, tying her hair up in a messy knot. Her planner sat untouched on the counter as she left the apartment. She told herself she just needed coffee, that it was practical, that she wasn't going out of her way. But when her feet carried her back to the corner bookstore cafe, she knew she was lying to herself. The bell over the door chimed when she stepped in. The place was half full, people scattered at tables with laptops and lattes. Stuart stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled, hair falling into his eyes. He didn't notice her right away, and she found herself studying the way he moved, quiet, precise, like he was afraid of taking up too much space. When he finally looked up, recognition flickered. His shoulders stiffened, then eased just slightly. You're back, he said. I told you, she replied, sliding onto a stool at the counter. This isn't the end. His lips quirked at the corner, but he didn't quite smile. What'll it be? Surprise me. He raised an eyebrow. That's risky. I trust you, she said simply. And something in his expression shifted the faintest flicker of the boy she remembered. Flashback. 10 years ago. It was sophomore year, a September evening still holding on to summer warmth. The school carnival buzzed with lights and noise, games clattering, rides creaking, music blaring from tinny speakers. Hazley had been standing off to the side, clutching her notebook like a lifeline. Then Stuart appeared, grin wide, grabbing her wrist without hesitation. Come on. She shook her head. I don't. You do now, he interrupted, tugging her into the throng. You're not wasting another carnival hiding in the corner. Before she could protest, he handed $1 to the ring toss booth and pressed a plastic ring into her hand. Aim for the goldfish. She laughed, nervous and out of place, but his enthusiasm was relentless. When she missed, he whooped as though it were the best throw he'd ever seen. When she finally landed a ring, he shouted loud enough for half the carnival to turn. She had left that night with the cheap stuffed bear and the dizzy feeling that she belonged, at least when she was beside him. Present. Stuart slid a mug across the counter. Steam curled from the surface, carrying the scent of caramel and something spicy cinnamon, maybe. Hazley wrapped her hands around the mug, the warmth seeping into her palms. You always did know how to make an entrance, she teased. He glanced at her, puzzled. The carnival, she prompted. Sophomore year. You dragged me out from behind the bleachers and made me play ring toss until I nearly cried from laughing. For a moment, his face softened. His eyes flicked downward, as though tugging the memory from some dusty corner. I think I remember that. You won a bear, right? Her smile widened. I still have it. Something flickered in his eyes, then a spark of the boy he once was, before it dimmed again. You're full of surprises, he said quietly. So are you, she countered. They fell into conversation, halting at first, but easier with each sip of coffee. She told him about her work, the chaos of planning weddings and corporate galas. He asked polite questions, though she noticed he rarely spoke of himself. When she pressed, he brushed it aside with vague answers. Finally, she leaned across the counter. You used to talk more than anyone I knew. What happened to you, Stuart? His jaw tightened. People change. She held his gaze. Not always for the better. The silence stretched, thick and uneasy. Then a customer approached, and the moment broke. Later, as she stepped back onto the street, Hazley tightened her coat against the drizzle. The city hummed around her, but all she could think of was the hollow in Stuart's eyes. She remembered the boy who once shouted her name across crowded hallways, who made her believe she wasn't invisible. She couldn't reconcile that boy with the man hiding behind coffee cups and half smiles. But she wasn't walking away. Not this time. She pulled out her phone, typing a quick message before she could second-guess herself. Dinner tomorrow? My treat. Her thumb hovered, then she hit send. And somewhere behind the cafe windows, Stuart's phone buzzed. Chapter 4. The space between. The days after their second meeting blurred for Stuart. The coffee shop carried on as usual. Early commuters clutching cups of espresso, university students staking out tables with laptops, and the occasional regular who wanted nothing more than silence and a corner. Stuart moved through it all in his quiet rhythm, brewing, steaming, serving, like he'd done for years, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Hazley had said she'd come by again. He hadn't asked when, and she hadn't promised a day, but something inside him expected her. He caught himself glancing at the door more often than he wanted to admit. And then she came back. It was late afternoon, the cafe in its quieter lull between the lunch rush and evening foot traffic. Stuart was restocking behind the counter when he heard the door chime. Her laugh carried across the room first, soft but certain, like a note played on a piano you hadn't realized was missing until it returned. She wasn't alone. A woman her age, tall, sharp-featured, with an air of self-importance, trailed behind her, scanning the place as if it might not be up to her standards. Hazley led her to a table and slid into a chair, all business now, flipping open a leather-bound planner. Client meeting, Stuart muttered under his breath, suddenly hyper-aware of the state of the tables. He smoothed his apron, then walked over, pen poised on his notepad. "Hey," Hazley said, glancing up. She smiled, the kind that was quick but genuine. "Hi," Stuart answered, his voice coming out steadier than he felt. "What can I get for you?" "Just a latte for me," Hazley said. Then, after a pause that lingered just a beat too long, "Extra foam, like you used to make." Stuart blinked, caught off guard. The words tugged at a memory. Late nights in high school when she'd convinced him to sneak out with her to the all-night diner, where he'd order plain coffee and she'd always get the frothy cappuccino, claiming it tasted like clouds. He hadn't thought of that in years. Her client ordered something complicated and overpriced, snapping him back to the present. Stuart nodded and retreated to the counter, working silently. His hands moved with muscle memory, but his mind was elsewhere. By the time he brought the drinks over, Hazley was mid-pitch. She gestured with her hands, animated, confident, a version of herself he couldn't reconcile with the shy girl he used to know. He set the mugs down gently, their fingers brushing for the briefest second when she reached for hers. A spark. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just something. The meeting stretched on for over an hour, and Stuart caught fragments as he wiped down tables nearby. Words like venue, timeline, and aesthetic floated in the air, but all he really heard was her voice weaving through them. When the client finally left, Hazley lingered. She tapped her spoon against the rim of her mug, glancing at him like she was deciding something. "Busy?" she asked. Stuart looked around the near-empty cafe. "Not really." "Good, come sit." She motioned to the chair across from her. He hesitated. He wasn't used to sitting with customers, especially not her. But she held his gaze, steady and patient, until he slid into the chair. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Hazley leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "You still don't really remember me, do you?" "I do," Stuart said quickly. "Bits and pieces. But not like you seem to remember me." Her smile softened, almost wistful. "That's because you were unforgettable to me, Stuart." The words hit harder than he expected. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't know how to respond to something so direct. So she filled the silence for him. "You were the loud one," she said with a laugh, "always dragging me into things. Choir auditions, senior bonfire, even that ridiculous dance battle in the cafeteria." He frowned, trying to picture it. He saw flickers, him laughing, pulling someone shy by the hand, cheering louder than necessary. Was that really him? "I don't feel like that person anymore," he admitted. "That's okay," she said gently. "People change, but I think pieces of him are still in there. You just need someone to remind you." Stuart looked down at his hands. They were calloused from years of carrying trays and scrubbing counters. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done something reckless, something purely for joy. And yet, sitting here with her, he felt the edges of that old self stir. That night, Stuart lay awake in his small apartment above the cafe. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. He thought about the way Hazley had looked at him, not with pity, but with recognition, as if she could still see someone inside him he'd long since buried. He wasn't sure if that terrified him or gave him hope. The following week, Hazley started showing up more often. Sometimes with her laptop, sometimes with a notebook, sometimes with nothing but the excuse of needing a quiet place to think. And sometimes, she pulled him out of his routine entirely. One Thursday evening, as he wiped down the espresso machine, she appeared at the counter with that mischievous smile he barely remembered from high school. "Close early," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Close early. Come with me." "I can't just—" "Yes, you can," she cut in, her eyes sparkling. "There's a street fair 3 blocks over. Live music, food stalls, people watching. It'll be fun. Remember fun?" Stuart's first instinct was to say no. He had work. He had closing duties. He had routines. But she was already tugging at his sleeve, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself flipping the open sign to closed 15 minutes early. The fair was loud and crowded, everything he usually avoided. But with Hazley weaving through the throngs, laughing and pulling him along, he didn't mind. She bought them fried dough, powdered sugar coating their fingers, and when a band started playing under the string lights, she didn't ask. She just grabbed his hand and spun him into the crowd. He stumbled at first, awkward and stiff, but her laughter was contagious, and soon he was laughing too, moving in time with her, the music pulsing through him. For a moment, he wasn't the quiet man behind the counter. He was the boy she remembered. And it felt good. Later that night, as they walked back to the cafe, Hazley slowed her steps. "I'm sorry if I pushed you too much," she said softly. Stuart shook his head. "No, it was good. I'd forgotten what that felt like." She smiled, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. "That's all I wanted." They stopped in front of the cafe, the glow of the streetlight painting her face in soft gold. For a heartbeat too long, neither moved. Then Stuart cleared his throat. "Good night, Hazley." "Good night, Stuart." She turned to go, and he watched her until she disappeared around the corner. And for the first time in years, Stuart realized he was looking forward to tomorrow. Chapter 5. Echoes of Yesterday. Hazley didn't plan her visits anymore. At first, she'd told herself they were convenient. She needed a quiet place to work, or she happened to be nearby between client calls. But the truth settled in quickly. She wanted to see Stuart. Not in the romantic, sweep you off your feet way. At least, not yet. What she craved was the comfort of their shared space, the ease that came from knowing he didn't need her to perform. With her clients, she was the woman who could fix anything, juggle 3 phones at once, charm, persuade, organize. With Stuart, she could sit across from him with a coffee cup growing cold and just breathe. The cafe was quiet on Tuesday morning, the kind of gray-skied day where time felt slower. Hazley sat by the window, her planner open but neglected. She was doodling in the margins when Stuart approached with 2 mugs. "I thought you might want this," he said, sliding hers toward her. She tilted her head. "I didn't order anything." "I know," he said, "but I remembered. You used to like hot chocolate better than coffee when it rained." Her chest tightened. A flash of memory lit up her mind. 15 years old, sitting on the front steps of his house after school, rain drizzling down as Stuart appeared with 2 steaming mugs his mom had made. He'd teased her about being too delicate for coffee, and she'd stuck her tongue out at him before burning it on the cocoa. "You remember that?" she asked softly. Stuart shrugged, embarrassed. "Some things stick." She sipped, the warmth blooming in her chest. Some things did stick. The silence stretched, not awkward but heavy with possibility. Then Hazley closed her planner and leaned forward. "Do you ever think about high school?" she asked. "Not often," Stuart admitted. "Why?" "Because I do," she said. "All the time, especially lately." She hesitated, then added, "You were everything back then. The way you'd show up for everyone, even when you didn't have to. You don't remember, but I do. You were the reason I stopped hiding." His brow furrowed like her words were both foreign and uncomfortable. "I wasn't anything special." "You were," she insisted, more firmly this time. "You just can't see it." That evening, Hazley found herself replaying memories in her apartment. The rain outside matched the weather in her mind, transporting her back to sophomore year. She'd been the invisible girl then, the one who never raised her hand in class, who ate lunch on the side bench instead of in the noisy cafeteria. She thought no one noticed. But Stuart had noticed. She remembered the day he sat beside her with his tray, grinning as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're wasting your time hiding out here," he'd said, stealing one of her carrot sticks. "Come on, sit with us." She'd been terrified, stammering out excuses, but he'd rolled his eyes. "Fine, I'll sit here with you then, but I'm not letting you eat in silence." And he hadn't. Day after day, he'd kept showing up, chipping away at her walls until she gave in and followed him into the cafeteria. He'd announced her like she was royalty, making her blush crimson, but it worked. People started to see her, and eventually she started to see herself differently too. She pressed her palms to her eyes, overwhelmed by the ache of remembering how alive he'd been then, how much light he'd carried, how different he seemed now. The next time she saw him, she suggested something bold. "Come over for dinner," she said, sliding her empty cup across the counter. Stuart looked up from the espresso machine, startled. "What?" "I'm serious. My place. Tomorrow night. I'll cook." He shook his head. Don't really what? Leave your cafe? Eat real food?" She arched a brow, playful but insistent. "You owe me. You closed early last week because of me. Let me return the favor." Stuart hesitated, then sighed. "One dinner." "Perfect," she said, grinning. Her apartment was nothing fancy, but it was warm, filled with little touches that reflected her personality. Framed photos of her travels, candles lined neatly on shelves, an absurd collection of coffee mugs she never used. When Stuart arrived, awkwardly clutching a bottle of cheap wine, she couldn't help but smile. "You brought something?" she teased. Seemed polite. "You could have brought nothing and it would still be polite," she said, taking the bottle anyway. "Come in." He lingered at the doorway like he wasn't sure he belonged in her space. But once he stepped inside, the air seemed to shift. They cooked together, if you could call it that. Hazley chopped vegetables while Stuart burned garlic bread, the smoke detector shrieking until they both dissolved into laughter. It felt like old times, like the kind of easy chaos they used to thrive in. Dinner stretched long into the evening, conversations spilling past old memories into quieter admissions about where they were now. Stuart talked about the bookstore, about how working there was supposed to be temporary, but became permanent when everything else in his life fell apart. Hazley talked about her career, about the pressure of always having to look like she had control even when she didn't. For once, neither of them pretended to be more than they were. By the time Stuart stood to leave, the city outside her windows was hushed, the streets glistening with the remnants of rain. Hazley walked him to the door, her heart hammering for reasons she couldn't explain. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For what?" "For this. For remembering me. Even when I don't." The words lodged in her chest. She wanted to tell him he wasn't just remembered. He was still here, still important, still the same boy who had once dragged her into the light. But instead, she smiled. "Anytime." That night, after he left, Hazley sat on her couch in the dim glow of the lamp, replaying every moment. She wasn't sure what this was becoming. Friendship, connection, something more. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was right where she was supposed to be. And when she finally drifted to sleep, she dreamed not of her polished career or future plans, but of a boy in a high school cafeteria, smiling wide as he made space for her at his table. Chapter 6. Fractures. The weeks that followed slipped into a rhythm neither of them defined, but both quietly welcomed. Hazley's visits became as predictable as the cafe's opening hours. Some mornings she'd slip in before work, ordering her latte with extra foam and teasing Stuart about whether he'd remembered the cinnamon. Other days she'd appear late, laptop in tow, pretending she needed a new space to brainstorm when in truth her brainstorming consisted mostly of glancing at Stuart over the rim of her cup. And he noticed. Not every time, not in a self-assured way, but in small flickers of awareness, when her laugh carried across the room, when she held her mug with both hands like she was warming more than just her fingers, when her presence made the place feel less hollow. Still, the cafe was only part of their world now. One Friday evening, Hazley convinced him to leave again. "It's not optional," she declared as she leaned over the counter while he restocked pastries. "You're coming with me." Stuart raised an eyebrow. "To what exactly?" "Trivia night. At that pub 2 streets over. My friend bailed on me and I can't show up alone like a loser." "You have other friends," he pointed out. "True," she said, "but none that will actually help me win." He smirked despite himself. "And what makes you think I'd be good at trivia?" She leaned closer, conspiratorial. "Because I remember. You used to know the most random things. Song lyrics, geography. Who won the Super Bowl in 2005? "Steelers," he said automatically before he could stop himself. Her grin widened. "Exactly, so come on." He sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. You're relentless. Thank you, she said sweetly. The pub was loud and crowded, the air thick with fried food and chatter. Stuart instinctively stiffened as they squeezed through the throng, but Hazley's hand brushed against his, steadying him in a way that felt both casual and intentional. They claimed a table in the corner, and when the trivia started, Stuart found himself drawn in despite his initial resistance. Hazley was hopeless at history questions, but brilliant with pop culture. Stuart carried them through science and geography. At one point, when he rattled off the capital of some obscure country, Hazley whooped so loudly half the bar turned to look. That's my teammate, she crowed, throwing an arm around his shoulders. The contact was brief but grounding, her warmth soaking through his shirt. He caught himself smiling. Not the small, polite smile he usually offered, but something fuller, closer to the boy he used to be. By the end of the night, they didn't win, but they didn't care. They walked back in the cool night air, Hazley's laughter still echoing. You were amazing, she said, nudging him with her elbow. I answered a few questions. You carried us, she insisted. I'm telling you, there's still light in there. You just need the right stage. Stuart's smile faltered at that, shadows creeping back in. The truth was, her words echoed in places he didn't want to revisit. Back in high school, the stage had been his. Not literally, he wasn't the theater type, but in spirit. He was the loud one, the connector, the one people leaned on without realizing they were leaning. Hazley remembered that. But after graduation, the world hadn't unfolded the way he thought it would. College had lasted one semester. He dropped out after the panic attack started, after he realized he wasn't built for lecture halls and exams and the constant pressure to succeed. Jobs came and went. Retail, delivery, warehouse shifts, until the bookstore cafe offered him stability, even if it meant smallness. It wasn't that he didn't dream anymore. He just stopped believing dreams were meant for him. One evening, weeks after trivia, Hazley pressed gently against that unspoken truth. They were sitting in her apartment again, takeout containers spread across the coffee table. She was recounting some absurd client request, a wedding planner demanding a horse to walk down the aisle, when she suddenly grew quiet. Stuart, she said, her voice softer now. Can I ask you something? He looked up, wary. Sure. Why here? Why the cafe? He frowned. What do you mean? You were, she hesitated, searching for the right words. You were the kind of person who seemed bigger than this town. You made everyone around you believe in more. And now, she trailed off, her eyes searching his. Now you're hiding. Why? The question landed heavy. For a long moment, Stuart stared at the half-eaten noodles in front of him, his throat tight. Finally, he said quietly, because everything else broke. Her chest tightened. What do you mean? He drew in a breath, exhaled slowly. I tried. College, jobs, plans, and every time I failed, or quit, or something failed me, and after a while, I figured maybe this was all I was meant for. Small, predictable, safe. The words tasted bitter even as he said them. Hazley reached across the table, her fingers brushing his knuckles. Safe isn't the same as alive, Stuart. He swallowed, unable to meet her eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the city outside her window. That night, Stuart walked home with a storm in his chest. Hazley wasn't wrong, but admitting that meant confronting a truth he'd spent years avoiding. He was terrified. Not of failure anymore, that was familiar, but of trying again, of daring to want more. And yet, some small part of him, the part she kept nudging awake, whispered that maybe he wasn't done. Maybe he wasn't broken beyond repair. The next day at the cafe, he found himself pulling out an old notebook from the bottom drawer of the counter. It was battered, the cover faded, pages yellowed from neglect. He hadn't touched it in years. Inside were song lyrics, half-finished poems, sketches of ideas he'd once thought mattered. He ran his fingers over the ink, remembering late nights scribbling by lamplight, believing words could carry him somewhere. When the door chimed and Hazley walked in, he closed the notebook quickly, sliding it out of sight. But she noticed the look on his face, and she smiled. That night, Hazley sat awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the way Stuart's voice had cracked when he said everything broke. She thought about the light she swore she could still see in him, even if he couldn't. She didn't want to fix him. She didn't need him to be the boy he once was. She just wanted him to remember he wasn't alone. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe that was enough. Chapter 7. The Things We Carried. The cafe had become their middle ground, her apartment their quiet retreat. But Hazley wanted to see Stuart somewhere else, somewhere the world pressed less heavily around him. "Come with me," she said one Saturday morning, tugging at his sleeve as he tried to rearrange the display of paperbacks near the counter. He looked up, suspicious. "Another ambush?" "Not an ambush," she insisted. "A field trip." "Field trip?" "Yes." Her grin was impish. "Like old times." "Old times?" "High school." His brows knitted as though he couldn't quite picture the connection. "You'll see," she promised. They ended up at the park on the north side of town, the one with the cracked basketball courts and the pond that always looked too murky to be safe. Kids were chasing kites across the grass, dogs barked at geese, and somewhere nearby a radio crackled with static-laced music. Hazley spread a blanket under a maple tree and plopped down, motioning for him to join. "Why here?" Stuart asked, lowering himself hesitantly onto the blanket. "Because this is where you saved me," she said matter-of-factly. He blinked. "What? You don't remember?" Her voice softened, pulling at something long buried. And suddenly, he did. Flashback 10 years ago. Hazley was 15, hiding again. That was what she did best. She'd fled the cafeteria after a group of girls laughed too loudly near her table, convinced they were laughing at her. She'd run across the schoolyard and found herself here on the edge of the park, curled up on the grass with her knees tucked to her chest. She hadn't heard Stuart approach. "Hey!" His voice had come, too bright, too familiar. She looked up, startled, brushing at her eyes. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you." He plopped down beside her without asking. "You disappeared after fourth period?" "I'm fine." "You're not," he said bluntly. "And that's okay. But you don't get to disappear. Not on my watch." She sniffed, embarrassed. "They don't like me." "Who?" "Everyone." Stuart shook his head. "Not true. I like you." She rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched. "That doesn't count." "Of course it counts. And besides, you don't need everyone. You just need one person who sees you. Lucky for you, you've got me." His grin had been so wide, so unshakable that she couldn't help but laugh through her tears. Then he'd stood, holding out his hand. "Come on," he'd said. "Let's play." "Play what?" "Anything. Doesn't matter. As long as you're not hiding." She'd hesitated, then slipped her hand into his. He pulled her to her feet, and together they'd run across the grass until her laughter drowned out the voices in her head. Present day. "I remember," Stuart said now, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. Hazley tilted her head, studying him. "Do you?" "Yeah," he admitted. "You were crying. I hated seeing you like that." "You fixed it," she said simply. Stuart shook his head. "No, I just sat with you." "That was enough," she said firmly. "It was everything." He swallowed, looking out at the pond where geese floated lazily. "I don't feel like that person anymore." Hazley followed his gaze. "That's because life chipped away at you. But you're still in there, Stuart. You're still the boy who wouldn't let me disappear." He wanted to argue. He wanted to say she was wrong. But the way she looked at him, steady, unwavering, made it hard to deny. They stayed in the park for hours, the conversation wandering between then and now. Hazley reminded him of the little things he'd long forgotten. How he'd scribbled lyrics on his sneakers in permanent marker, how he'd convinced her to sing at the talent show by threatening to juggle cafeteria trays alone if she didn't join him. Stuart laughed, genuinely laughed, at memories that had faded to sepia in his mind. You were fearless back then, Hazley said, smiling. Or stupid, he countered. Sometimes they're the same thing, she teased. When the sun dipped low and the air grew cooler, they packed up the blanket and walked back through the neighborhood streets. The familiarity of it all tugged at Stuart's chest, like time folding in on itself, past and present colliding. As they reached her car, Hazley glanced at him with a small, thoughtful smile. Thank you, she said. For what? For not letting me disappear back then, and for not letting me give up on you now. Stuart's throat tightened. He looked at her, standing there in the glow of the setting sun, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Seen. That night, back in his apartment, Stuart opened the old notebook again. He stared at the unfinished lyrics, the jagged lines of handwriting. He didn't know if he could ever be that boy again. But maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely gone. And Hazley's voice echoed in his mind. You just need one person who sees you. She had once needed him to remind her she mattered. Now, without realizing it, she was doing the same for him. Chapter 8. Worlds Collide. The week after the park, Hazley found herself smiling too easily. Not the polite smile she wore at work, not the automatic one when her clients signed contracts, but the kind that came without asking, sparked by some remembered detail of Stuart's laugh, or the way his eyes softened when he let his guard down. She told herself not to overthink it. It wasn't about romance, or fixing him, or rewriting the past. It was just comfort, familiarity, a tether. Still, when her friend Claire invited her to dinner that Friday, Hazley hesitated. Claire loved to surround herself with people, loud, talkative people, and Hazley worried Stuart would shrink in the noise. But something inside her rebelled at the thought of keeping him tucked away from the rest of her life. So she asked. Dinner? Stuart repeated, eyebrows raised as they sat in the back corner of the coffee shop, mugs between them. With some friends, Hazley explained. Nothing fancy, just food, talking, normal people things. Normal people things, he echoed as if the words belonged to a foreign language. You don't have to say yes, she added quickly. I just thought it might be nice. Stuart stared into his coffee for a long moment, then lifted his gaze to hers. You really think I'll fit into that? I know you will, she said without hesitation. Claire's apartment was alive with chatter when they arrived. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air. Music hummed low from a speaker, and laughter spilled from the kitchen where a group of people crowded around the stove. Stuart froze just inside the doorway, shoulders tightening. Hazley touched his arm lightly. Hey, breathe. You're okay. He nodded stiffly, letting her guide him toward the group. Claire swept Hazley into a hug before noticing Stuart. And this must be the famous friend, she said warmly, extending a hand. Claire, I've heard stories. Stuart blinked, awkward but polite as he shook her hand. Stuart. Welcome, she said, already pulling them into the circle of conversation. The evening unfolded in bursts of noise and quiet. Hazley watched as Stuart hovered on the edges at first, responding with short answers when asked questions, retreating into silence when the conversation grew too quick. But then someone asked about music, and Stuart, almost reluctantly, mentioned he used to write songs. That was all it took. Suddenly, the group leaned closer, curious, asking what kind of songs, if he still wrote, if he'd play something sometime. Stuart's face turned faintly pink, his hands worrying at the edge of his sleeve, but he didn't shut down. He spoke, quietly, about lyrics scribbled in notebooks, about melodies that came at midnight. And for the first time in years, he was listened to. Hazley sat back, watching him come alive under the simplest of encouragements. Her chest ached with something tender and complicated. Later, as they walked back to her car under the glow of street lamps, Stuart was uncharacteristically quiet. Too much? She asked softly. He shook his head. No, it was good. Strange, but good. You held your own. He smirked faintly. Barely. Better than barely, she insisted. He hesitated, then said, it felt weird, being asked about something that used to matter. Like people actually wanted to hear it. They did, she said. He looked at her, eyes shadowed but searching. You really think I'm still that guy? The one who wrote songs worth hearing? Her answer was immediate. Yes, absolutely. The words seemed to hang between them, heavier than they should have been. Back at her apartment, Hazley poured them both tea. The air was quieter here, the kind of quiet that pressed in without suffocating. Stuart sat at her small kitchen table, turning the mug in his hands. You're stubborn, he said suddenly. She arched a brow. Excuse me? You don't let things go, not with me. She leaned against the counter, considering him. Maybe I learned it from you. He gave a short laugh. From me? Yeah, you used to be the most stubborn person I knew. You never let me hide. You never let me believe I didn't matter. Maybe I'm just returning the favor. The laugh faded, replaced by something softer. He looked down at his mug. It scares me sometimes, that you still see me that way. Why? Because I don't. The silence stretched. Hazley crossed the room, set her hand over his. Then let me hold it for you until you can, she said quietly. His breath caught. He didn't pull away. When he finally left that night, Hazley lingered at the door, heart beating faster than it should have. This wasn't about romance, at least not yet. It was about trust, about slowly building a bridge over the years and silences that had carved a canyon between them. But as she watched him disappear down the hallway, she couldn't help but feel it. The shift. Small, quiet, but undeniable. Something was changing. And she wasn't sure either of them could stop it. Chapter 9. A gentle return. The gallery smelled faintly of paint and champagne, and Hazley felt the familiar pulse of nerves under her skin as she smoothed the skirt of her dress. Normally, she thrived in these moments. The lighting just right, the tables set perfectly, the hum of conversation and undercurrent of validation. But tonight, her stomach coiled for a different reason. Stuart. He stood by the far wall, posture stiff, hands shoved in his pockets. Out of place among the chatter and polished laughter, like a sketch left unfinished in a room of framed masterpieces. Hazley drifted through clusters of guests, smiling, nodding, answering questions about the caterer and the artist. But her eyes found him again and again, always on the periphery, always quiet. When she finally reached him, he gave her a small, rueful smile. This is a lot. I know. She tilted her head toward the exit doors. Want some air? Relief flickered across his face. Yes, please. They stepped into the cool night. The city buzzed around them, traffic lights blinking, the muted thrum of cars, a couple laughing too loudly as they passed. Sorry, Stuart said, rubbing at his arm. I didn't mean to drag you away from your event. You didn't, she said softly. You're part of my night too. His shoulders eased, just barely. They walked without speaking for a block, the silence between them companionable now. Finally, he glanced at her. You're good at this. All of it. The way people just follow your lead. Hazley laughed quietly. That's not how it used to be. And just like that, her mind slipped back flashback junior year. The school gym smelled like rubber and old sweat. Hazley sat at the edge of the bleachers, hunched into herself, knees pulled tight. The spring talent show audition sign-up sheet lay in her lap, half filled in shaky handwriting. She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But the thought of standing under those lights, alone, made her palms sweat. Then Stuart dropped into the seat beside her, all easy grin and restless energy. His dark hair fell over his forehead, his eyes catching hers with a spark she couldn't quite name. Why are you sitting here like you're waiting for a firing squad? Hazley flushed. I'm not. He leaned over, plucking the sheet from her lap. Auditions? Maybe. You're doing it, he said, no hesitation. I'll be front row. Promise. Her chest tightened. What if I mess up? He grinned. Then you'll mess up spectacularly, and I'll cheer the loudest. For a second, she believed him. For a second, she believed herself. Present. Paisley smiled faintly, eyes on the pavement as they walked. You used to be the fearless one. You were the one who pulled me out of corners. Stuart's laugh was soft, almost disbelieving. That kid feels like someone else entirely. Not to me. He looked at her then. Really looked, and she saw it. That flicker of recognition, of remembering himself through her. They ended the night at a quiet diner, sliding into a booth sticky from years of late-night coffee. The waitress barely looked up as she set menus on the table. I can't remember the last time I sat in a place like this, Stuart said, glancing around. High school, Paisley reminded him. We used to come after basketball games, remember? He smirked faintly. Yeah, you ordered pancakes at 11 at night like it was the most normal thing in the world. It is normal, she grinned. You just didn't appreciate breakfast the way I did. The banter was easy, natural. For the first time in a long while, Paisley felt like she had her friend back. Not the shell of him, but Stuart, warm and real across from her. And maybe, just maybe, the world was tilting them towards something more. That night, as she dropped him at his apartment, he hesitated at the curb. Thanks, he said. For what? For reminding me of things I'd forgotten. Her heart squeezed. She wanted to say, I've never forgotten, but she bit her tongue, offering only a soft smile. Anytime. He nodded, turned toward his building, but halfway up the steps he looked back. And in the glow of the streetlight, Paisley thought she saw it, the beginning of color returning to him. Chapter 10. Cracks in the glass. The following week was quieter than Paisley expected. Too quiet. Her phone stayed stubbornly silent. No text from Stuart asking if she wanted to grab a coffee after work. No unexpected calls at odd hours. At first she brushed it off. He'd said the gallery night had been a lot. Maybe he just needed to recharge. But by Thursday, the silence felt heavier. She caught herself glancing at her phone between client meetings, scrolling through their recent messages at night as if to confirm she hadn't missed something. The ache in her chest was subtle but insistent, like a bruise pressed again and again. Finally, she called. It rang and rang before dropping to voicemail. Hey, it's me, she said, trying to keep her voice light. Just checking in. No pressure. She hesitated, then added softly, I hope you're okay. She hung up and stared at the phone, wishing she hadn't sounded so much like she was talking to a closed door. Stuart, meanwhile, sat cross-legged on his apartment floor, the phone face down on the rug. The call still echoed in his head. Paisley's voice warm, patient, familiar. Too familiar. He tipped his head back against the couch, exhaling hard. He could feel it happening. The way he leaned on her laughter to cut through his silences, the way her encouragement made him want to try again, the way her presence filled the emptiness he'd grown used to. It was too much. She deserved more than being an anchor for someone who couldn't stand steady on his own. He hadn't told her that nights still blurred together, that sleep came only after pages of half-written lyrics bled into the dawn. He hadn't told her how much it hurt to walk into the bookstore each morning and know that was the sum of his world. How could he tell her without making her carry it? So he chose silence instead. Flashback senior year. Paisley's car wouldn't start. It was nearly midnight after the spring dance, and she sat behind the wheel, embarrassed and frustrated, turning the key to the same hollow click. Stuart leaned against the hood, tucked jacket off, tie hanging loose. You realize this car is held together by stubbornness and duct tape, right? She groaned, dropping her forehead to the steering wheel. Don't start. He laughed, easy and bright, before opening the driver's door. Scoot. What are you? Push it into neutral. I'll get us rolling. We'll jump it at the bottom of the hill. Paisley stared at him. That's insane. Insanely brilliant, he corrected, already moving to the back. And somehow, against all reason, it worked. The engine roared to life at the bottom of the street, and she leaned out the window, breathless, watching him jog to catch up. "You're ridiculous," she shouted. He grinned, hair wild, cheeks flushed. "And you're welcome." In that moment, she'd believed there was nothing he couldn't fix. Present. Now, sitting alone at her kitchen table, Hazley thought about that night, about the boy who had been unstoppable, and wondered where he had gone. She wanted to believe he was still there, buried under the weight of the years. But how do you save someone who keeps slipping further from your reach? By Saturday, Hazley couldn't take it anymore. She walked into the bookstore cafe just before closing, heart pounding. Stuart looked up from behind the counter, surprise flickering across his face. "Hey," he said cautiously. "Hey yourself." She tried to keep her tone steady. "You've been hard to find." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Sorry, I've just needed space." "From me?" The words hung sharp between them. Stuart's silence was answer enough. Her chest tightened. "You don't get to do that, Stuart. You don't get to pull me back into your world and then shut the door without explaining why." His jaw clenched. "I don't want you to think you have to fix me." "I don't," she said fiercely. "I'm not here to fix you. I'm here because I want to be, because you matter to me." He looked away, voice low. "And what if I can't matter back?" Hazley's throat ached. She stepped closer, searching his face. "You already do." The room fell into silence, broken only by the hum of the espresso machine cooling. Stuart swallowed hard, eyes flickering with something raw. But instead of answering, he shook his head. "I can't do this right now," he whispered and slipped past her, locking the front door behind him. Hazley stood alone in the empty shop, staring at the space he'd left behind. For the first time since they'd found each other again, doubt crept in, cold and unyielding. But beneath the doubt, something else sparked. Not anger, not despair. Resolve. She wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Chapter 11. The Bridge Back. Hazley spent Sunday in a haze of restless motion. She cleaned her apartment twice, rearranged the bookshelf, watered her plants even though the soil was already damp. Anything to keep her hands busy, anything to silence the ache of Stuart's words. What if I can't matter back? She replayed it again and again, the way his voice had sounded tired, brittle, as if the weight of hope itself might crush him. And she hated how easily she'd let him walk away. Hated that she hadn't found the right words to break through. By nightfall, she sat curled on her couch, lights dim, a half-eaten carton of takeout abandoned on the coffee table. The city glowed faintly through her balcony doors, but she barely saw it. She wanted to call him. She wanted to tell him that mattering wasn't something you earned or proved. It was something you already were. But instead, she sat in silence, afraid another unanswered call would only drive the wedge deeper. It was nearly midnight when the knock came. 3 soft raps, hesitant. Hazley's heart jolted. She set down her tea and hurried to the door, fumbling with the chain. When it swung open, Stuart stood in the hallway, a paper bag of takeout balanced in his hands. His eyes looked uncertain, shadowed with apology. "Hi," he said quietly. For a beat, she just stared at him, torn between relief and the urge to shake him. "Hi." He held up the bag like an offering. "Peace offering?" General Tso's chicken, extra fortune cookies. Her lips twitched despite herself. "You remembered." "I've never forgotten." The words were simple, but they landed heavy in her chest. She stepped back, pulling the door wider. "Come in." They ate cross-legged on the living room floor, cartons spread between them, the kind of makeshift dinner that felt more real than anything else. For a long time, they didn't talk. Chopsticks clicked softly, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Finally, Stuart set his food down and leaned back against the couch. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. Hazley swallowed a mouthful of rice, studying him. "For disappearing?" "For everything," he admitted. "For shutting down. For letting you think I don't want you here when it's the opposite." Her chest tightened. Then why push me away? He rubbed at his jaw, searching for words. Because it scares me. The way I need this. Need you. I don't know how to carry that without breaking it. Her eyes softened. You don't have to carry it alone. That's the point. He met her gaze, something raw flickering there. You always make it sound so simple. Because it is, she whispered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city hummed faintly outside the windows, the clock ticking steady in the background. Then Stuart reached for a fortune cookie, cracking it open. He read the slip silently, lips twitching. What does it say? Hazley asked. He hesitated, then passed it to her. An old friend will bring you new light. Her breath caught. She looked up at him, and for the first time since their reunion, his smile reached his eyes. Flashback sophomore year. Rain hammered the pavement as they dashed across the school parking lot, shoes splashing in puddles. Hazley squealed as Stuart tugged her by the hand, both of them soaked through. You're insane, she shouted over the downpour. Correction, fun, he yelled back, spinning her once before pulling her under the awning of the gym doors. They collapsed against the wall, breathless with laughter, water dripping from their hair and clothes. Hazley pressed her hands to her cheeks flushed. We're going to catch pneumonia. Stuart grinned, eyes gleaming. Then at least we'll be in the nurse's office together. She laughed so hard her stomach hurt, feeling for the first time in her life like the world wasn't something to hide from. Present. The memory lingered like warmth after rain as she watched Stuart now, sitting cross-legged on her rug, hair falling into his eyes. Different years, different people, but the same tether, pulling taut between them. Later, after the food was gone and their laughter had softened into quiet conversation, Stuart leaned back against the couch again. You ever wonder, he murmured, what would have happened if we'd stayed in touch after graduation? All the time, Hazley admitted. Do you think it would have been easier? She considered, then shook her head. No, but maybe it would have been less lonely. His throat worked. He reached for his water, then set it down again, hands restless. I don't deserve how patient you are with me. Hazley leaned closer, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to deserve it. That's not how this works. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the air between them charged and fragile. Stuart exhaled slowly, shoulders easing for the first time in days. I'm really glad you didn't let me disappear. Her chest ached, but this time it was a good ache, a full ache. Me too. By the time Stuart left, the sky was just beginning to pale at the edges, the promise of dawn stirring on the horizon. He paused at the door, glancing back at her, something unspoken in his gaze. Good night, Hazley, he said softly. She smiled. Good night. The door closed behind him, but the room still felt warm, still felt full. For the first time since their reunion, Hazley didn't worry about what tomorrow might bring. Because tonight had proven something neither of them could deny. The bridge between them wasn't broken. It was still there, stronger than they knew. Chapter 12, The Longest Night. The city was quiet in that rare way it could be, its heartbeat muted under the weight of falling snow. The storm had started at dusk, dusting the rooftops in white and making every streetlight blur in a soft halo. Hazley watched from her living room window, the world beyond glowing dimly like a memory she was halfway convinced she had dreamed. Inside, her house was warm, the faint scent of cinnamon candles clinging to the air, and Stuart sat on her couch like he had been there forever. It wasn't their first evening together outside the cafe or their walks, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was because he had stayed after helping her carry event supplies up from her car. Maybe it was because neither of them seemed in a hurry for him to leave. Stuart nursed the mug of tea she had made him, his fingers wrapped around it, not drinking so much as holding it like he was grateful for the warmth. Hazley curled up across from him, her knees pulled beneath her hair loose around her shoulders. The faint fire crackled in the corner fireplace, painting them both in soft amber light. They didn't talk at first. It was a silence filled with comfort, not distance, and that startled both of them in the best possible way. Finally, Hazley broke it. "You know," she said softly, "you used to hate quiet like this. You'd make up stories or hum or drag me outside just to fill the air." Stuart tilted his head, smiling faintly as his gaze stayed on the fire. "Guess I didn't know how to sit still back then. I thought if I stopped moving, stopped making noise, people would stop noticing me. And maybe I didn't want to be forgotten." Her chest ached. She leaned forward. "I never forgot you." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and they landed in the room like sparks catching dry wood. Stuart finally looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes, vulnerable, almost boyish. He set his mug down, folding his hands together. "I don't know why you'd even remember me the way I was. I wasn't—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I wasn't anything worth holding on to." "You are everything worth holding on to," she said, her voice steady now. "You made me believe I could be more than the quiet girl who hid behind her hair. You pulled me out of corners. You saw me before anyone else did." He swallowed, his throat bobbing as though he wanted to answer but couldn't. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was weighted, trembling with everything unsaid between them. Hazley leaned back slightly, pulling her legs closer. "It scares me sometimes, Stuart. The way I remember things so clearly. Like, the night of our senior year carnival, when you won me that ridiculous stuffed bear because I didn't have the courage to play the ring toss myself. Or the way you'd wait outside my class so we could walk the long way home. Those things, they stuck. They mattered to me." Stuart let out a long breath, rubbing his palms over his jeans. "And now it feels like we traded places, doesn't it? You're the one pulling me forward, the one seeing me when I feel like no one else does." He hesitated. "Sometimes I think, if you hadn't walked into that cafe, I might have just kept fading." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak gently. "Then I guess I was meant to walk in." The fire cracked again. Snow pressed heavy against the windows. The world felt impossibly far away, like nothing existed beyond these four walls. Stuart leaned back into the couch, finally sipping his tea. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. "I don't think I've told anyone about why I stayed. Why I never left the bookstore cafe. It was easier, you know, being surrounded by stories that weren't mine. I could shelve them, pour coffee, watch people live their lives, and not have to explain how I'd lost track of mine." Hazley nodded slowly. "But you're not lost, Stuart. You just stopped walking. And maybe I was meant to remind you how." They didn't say anything for a while. The warmth of the fire filled the gaps, but so did their presence, unspoken yet undeniable. Then Hazley shifted, reaching across the couch, her hand brushing his. It was small, tentative, but it made his eyes flicker down in surprise. He didn't pull away. Slowly, he let his fingers fold around hers, their hands resting between them on the cushion. "I don't want you to disappear," she whispered, her voice trembling now, more vulnerable than she had meant it to be. "Not again." He squeezed her hand, his gaze meeting hers with something so steady it nearly broke her. "I'm not planning on it." For a long time, they just sat there, holding hands, their breaths almost in rhythm. Hazley wanted to say more. Everything that had been building inside her for years, but she kept it tucked close. Not yet. Not tonight. Still, she knew. He knew. The air was too charged with truth for either of them to pretend. Hours slipped by. They laughed quietly about old high school memories, about teachers and small humiliations and the little triumphs that had meant the world back then. At one point, Hazley disappeared into her bedroom and returned with an old shoebox she hadn't touched in years. Inside were folded notes from classes, faded Polaroids, and a crumpled concert ticket they'd gone to together once. Stuart held the ticket between his fingers, staring at it like it was some artifact from a world he'd forgotten. "I remember this night," he said softly. "You hated the noise. I thought you'd never forgive me for dragging you there." "And then you held my hand," Hazley said, smiling faintly. "And suddenly the noise wasn't so bad." Their eyes met again, and it was too much. Too bright, too fragile, too real. Paisley closed the box quickly, setting it aside, but the silence that followed carried the weight of all those memories reborn between them. By the time the clock struck past midnight, neither of them had moved far. Paisley stretched out under a blanket, her eyelids heavy, and Stuart sat beside her still, one hand resting near hers like he wasn't sure if it would be crossing a line to hold it again. She drifted in and out of sleep, half aware of the sound of the fire dimming, the snow still falling, and Stuart's quiet breathing beside her. And when she woke in the middle of the night, the blanket tucked more snugly around her shoulders, Stuart had fallen asleep sitting up on the couch, his head tilted back, exhaustion softening the edges of his face. For the first time in years, Paisley felt at home, like the missing piece of her life had settled back into place, even if they hadn't said the words yet. Even if they hadn't confessed. That, she knew, was coming. And she was ready. Chapter 13. The window between us, morning light spilled into Paisley's living room like a hesitant guest. The storm had passed overnight, leaving the world washed in white. Snow clung to the windows, softening the edges of everything outside, and for the first time in a long time, Paisley didn't dread what the day would bring. She stirred beneath the blanket on the couch, blinking at the quiet room. The fire had long since gone out, leaving behind only the faint smell of smoke and ash. Her eyes drifted to the other end of the couch where Stuart was still asleep, his head tipped against the cushions, his arms folded loosely across his chest. For a moment, she let herself look at him the way she hadn't been brave enough to before. Not just Stuart, the boy she remembered from high school, the boy who used to make her laugh until she forgot she was shy, the boy who walked her home when no one else cared if she made it back. But Stuart now, worn and tired, yet still carrying that unspoken warmth. She realized how much she had missed him, not just as a memory, but as a presence in her life. She thought of all the times she had wondered what became of him, if he had been happy, if he had found someone to hold the version of him she used to carry in her heart. And now he was here, asleep on her couch, and the weight of all those years pressed heavy and sweet against her ribs. Paisley stood quietly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and padded into the kitchen to make coffee. The smell soon filled the house, and Stuart stirred awake at the sound of clinking mugs. He blinked, groggy, his voice husky with sleep. "What time is it?" "Almost 9, she said softly. "Snow stopped. Roads are still a mess, though." He rubbed his eyes, then looked at her, his expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and gratitude. "I didn't mean to fall asleep on you. Guess I was more tired than I thought." Paisley set a steaming mug in front of him, the same way he used to set coffee in front of her back at the cafe. "It's okay. You can stay as long as you want." Their eyes lingered on each other a beat too long before they both looked away, sipping quietly at their mugs. By afternoon, the world outside had brightened, glittering with untouched snow. They decided to step out, bundled in coats and scarves, and walked through the hushed neighborhood. The crunch of snow under their boots filled the silence, but it wasn't the heavy kind of silence anymore. It was the kind that felt like a shared secret. "Do you ever think about it?" Paisley asked after a while, her voice muffled by her scarf. "About who we used to be?" Stuart's breath clouded in the air. "Every day," he admitted. "Sometimes it feels like I used up all my color back then, like I burned too bright and too fast, and all I had left was quiet." Paisley stopped walking, turning to face him. The winter air stung her cheeks, but her voice was steady. "That's not true. You're still you, Stuart. You just forgot. And maybe that's okay, because now I get to remind you." Something flickered in his eyes then, like hope, like fear, like recognition all at once. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. That evening, after they returned to her house and shook the snow from their coats, they settled back into the living room. This time, there was no fire, just the dim glow of lamps and the soft hum of the heater. Stuart leaned back, his hands folded in his lap. "You know, when I saw you at the cafe that first day, I almost didn't recognize you." "Almost?" Paisley teased lightly, though her heart was racing. He smiled faintly. "Your hair's shorter. You carry yourself differently. Confident. Like you finally believe what I always knew about you. His smile faded into something quieter. But then you hugged me, and it was like everything came back at once. Like no time had passed at all. Her throat tightened. She shifted closer to him on the couch, the air between them heavy with all the things they hadn't said. "Stuart," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked, and the weight of his gaze made it impossible for her to hold back anymore. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Back then, in high school, I don't think I ever said it out loud, but I felt it. Every day I felt it. When you pulled me into your world, when you made me laugh, when you believed in me more than I believed in myself. I thought it was just friendship. I told myself it had to be, but it wasn't." Stuart froze, his breath catching. Hazley's hands twisted together in her lap. "I was in love with you. I think part of me still is. No, not part of me. Most of me. I carried it with me through college, through every relationship that didn't work. Through every night I wondered where you'd gone. And when I saw you again, it wasn't just nostalgia, it was everything I had been holding back." Tears pricked her eyes, but she didn't look away. "I don't need you to say it back. I can't keep it quiet anymore. You mattered to me then, and you matter to me now, more than anyone ever has." The silence that followed stretched long, fragile, like the world was holding its breath. Stuart's chest rose and fell unevenly, his hands gripping his knees. He looked stunned, almost pained, like the words had cracked something open inside him he wasn't ready to face. But then he leaned forward, his voice low and rough. "Hazley, you don't know how many times I wanted to say the same thing. Back then I was too scared, too sure you deserved someone better, someone brighter. And when I left, I thought I had ruined every chance I might have had. I thought—" His voice broke. "I thought I lost you forever." Her breath hitched. He reached out then, his hand trembling as it found hers. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, slow, reverent. "But if you're telling me there's still something here, if you're telling me I didn't lose you, then, Hazley, I can't—" He shook his head, a small, helpless laugh escaping. "I can't pretend anymore either. I loved you then. I love you now." Her tears finally spilled, but they were matched by the brightness in her smile. She squeezed his hand, leaning closer, her forehead brushing his. For a long moment, they just breathed each other in, the air thick with the years of silence that had finally broken. And then, finally, after all the waiting, all the missed chances, all the nights wondering and wishing, Stuart kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as though they were both afraid the moment would dissolve if they pressed too hard. But then Hazley leaned into him, her hands slipping up to the back of his neck, and the kiss deepened. It was fierce, desperate, the kind of kiss that carried years of longing and the relief of finally being found. When they pulled back, their foreheads still touching, both of them were breathless. Stuart laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. That was overdue. Hazley smiled through her tears. Years in the making. They sat there together, wrapped in the quiet certainty that they had finally arrived where they were always meant to be. Not in the cafe, not in the past, but here, in this moment, where the window between them had finally disappeared. And as snow began to fall again outside, neither of them let go. Thanks for listening. Stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next story.